I'm Lindee Goodall from Lindee Embroidery, and this is Embroidery Basics. If you're new to embroidery, you're in the right spot. So we're going to be discussing a variety of things in here. It's mostly based on my book called The Embroidery Recipe. I'll read you the recipe here shortly. We're going to focus mostly, though, on the hooping part and stabilizing, because that seems to be what fumbles most people in the beginning. There's so much to learn about embroidery. So it's going to be a fun journey if you're just getting started. So if you're on YouTube, the products that we show in here and we talk about are back on the website. So you need to switch back to where you logged in and you'll see all those products listed down below. And if you're on the website and you want to chat, then you need to log into your YouTube account and then you'll go to YouTube and you can chat there. And I will be answering questions. This is recorded, so if you missed anything, you can always go back. So I'll be listing a special code down here that you can use during the event to get special discounts. And I'll also list links for products, and I'll probably, show a little picture of it up here somewhere so that you know what I'm talking about, because not everything I have here is the same as what's on the website. And that's because a lot of my stuff is older and there are newer models out there that are even cooler and better. So let's get started. So here we have the embroidery recipe, and I'm going to read it to you. Do you have a machine that tells you how much time it's going to take to sew a design? It'll say 16 minutes to sew this design, and you're thinking, wow, I can have this done in 20 minutes. No, not really. So you're going to have a preparation time, and that's longer than you think. It's kind of like, when you get a recipe and it says preparation time is 20 minutes and cooking time is this and cooling time is that. We have times like that in embroidery, but our machine doesn't tell us that. So you're going to need some equipment. You're going to need an embroidery machine, and I have a new Brother Luminaire over here. And you'll need needles. We'll talk about needles, and you need thread, and you need to have a hoop, and you'll need stabilizers. And I classify stabilizers with the ingredients. So some of our ingredients include your fabric, your design, thread, backing, topping, and adhesives. An adhesive might be tape, it might be a spray. And so for preparation time, I have longer than you think. And cooking time is kind of like stitch count times machine speed plus color changes. And any boo-boos that you need to stop and correct along the way. So for example, you may get a bird's nest, and you'll want one of these kits. This is the bird's nest toolkit to dig those out. So here's the instructions. Making sure the design is compatible with the fabric, hoop using appropriate hooping techniques in desired fabric location with appropriate backings, toppings, and adhesives. Season with threads as desired. Set machine tensions carefully to avoid burning. That would also include hoop tensions because you don't want to have hoop burn. Sew until done in properly maintained machine. And when we talk about maintained machine, we mean it needs to be cleaned, it needs to be well serviced, and it needs to be properly tensioned. Trim threads, remove from hoop promptly, discard backing, serve with pride and joy. So you can see how embroidery is very similar to, say, cooking. And we're going to focus mostly on the hooping part. I'm going to show you how I was taught to hoop way back when I started back in, I think, 1994. And then I learned that, well, it didn't really work. It worked on the machine I had at that time because my hoop was about yay big and you couldn't do too much wrong with it. But now that we have these ginormous hoops, we need to really hoop and stabilize properly. So let's talk about that. So here is the embroidery recipe book, and I've printed it out. It is a digital book, and you can see it is big. It has lots of troubleshooting charts in it. It is also on the website, and you can download it. It's a PDF, and I like PDF books because they're so much easier to search. I know some of you like paper, and yes, you can print it out yourself. You can take it somewhere and be printed. There are places that you can do that. So we'll put that away before I throw that on the floor. And I'm going to talk about hooping. And we're going to start with this fabric. And this is a knit. You can see that it's very stretchy. And I just have my little 4x4 hoop. And I can't really move the camera very easily. So I'm just going to hoop this and then I'll hold it up so you can see it. And I am going to hoop standing up. I'm going to loosen my hoop And this is a knit, so I'm going to need a piece of cutaway. But I'm going to hoop it the way they showed me to hoop in the beginning. So they said, put your fabric in the hoop, press your inner hoop in, and it should be pretty loose. And then you're going to pull on this. They said, your fabric should be drum tight. And then you're going to tighten the screw as much as possible. Some of the early machines even had tools that could tighten the screw. Now, can you see the stripes? They're all crooked. And even though we can't see that on a woven, it's still happening on a woven. We just don't see it easily. And if I touch around on here, I can feel that there's some spots that are pretty tight, like on the sides, and some parts that are really soft, like in the corners, because the corners provide a better grip. So I can't pull it as easily in the corners. Also down here where I tighten the screw, as I tighten the screw this way, it's not distributing the tightness all the way around. It's only tightening the hoop right there. And as it tightens the hoop, it's actually pushing the fabric together. So the fabric is actually looser right there. So if I'd had to tighten this screw, then I'm going to unloosen it because I couldn't possibly get the fabric in there without it being a little bit looser. Could be a little bit tighter. I would finger tighten that if I needed to tighten the screw, and then I'm going to pop this out. I would place my fabric again, and I'm going to, I'll see if I can do this sitting down, and press the hoop in like that. And there we have that. Now, I don't have a stabilizer in there, so this is not going to work very well. But what they told me back in 1994 was after you do all that business with screwing and tightening and pulling and all of that, then you slide a piece of stabilizer underneath. And the stabilizer only needed to be slightly bigger than the design. Well, that worked pretty good until I stitched on a sweatshirt one morning. And of course, this sweatshirt was for a Christmas project at work. We were having a Christmas gift exchange, and I had this little cat, and it said Meowie Christmas on it. And I was putting it on a sweatshirt, and I put it in my machine, and here's my machine. It had a hoop about 3.5 by 3.5 inches, and it sewed at a whopping 300 stitches per minute. Well, I put it in the machine. I sewed the first color, went and got in the shower, and I hopped out and I changed the color, and then I dried my hair, and then I changed the color, and I did whatever. And when I came back, this little cat, instead of having a hat sitting on his head, the hat was kind of floating up above his head. And so I thought, what am I going to do now? That was the only sweatshirt I had. So I took it to my sewing machine, and I just kind of went back and forth with the right kind of stitches and the right color thread, and nobody knew the difference. And it was kind of one of those parties where the first person gets to pull a present off the table, and they unwrap it, and if somebody else pulls a present off and they don't like it and they like yours better, they can grab your present. My present made the rounds for about 6 times, so I felt pretty good about that. So that's how we shouldn't hoop. How should we hoop? Let's do this again. I'm going to loosen this up because now I have cutaway, and I'll place the cutaway down like that, and I'm going to put the fabric over like this. I'll see if I had 3 cameras in here, I could have an overhead camera doing all of this. And then I'm going to press this in. I'm going to see if I can do this sitting down. So this hoop has an arrow at the top so that I know which goes to the top. And it looks like it's symmetrical, but I don't know that it really is. So I'm going to press first in towards the top. And the screw on this hoop is at the bottom. So then I'm going to press and rotate it in like that. And I got it a little bit skewed down here at the bottom. You can see how it dips a little bit. And what I would probably do on this fabric, since it is so stretchy, would be to spray my stabilizer, smooth my fabric onto my stabilizer, and then put it in the hoop. Now, back when I had this machine, it didn't have too many features. You couldn't baste in the hoop on this. If you wanted to baste, you had to do it in software. So, and I don't think any of us knew about basting in the hoop back then anyway. But I would still probably baste in the hoop. And also, once you do this, you should take it to your machine and sew it right away. You do not want to leave your project sitting in the hoop any longer than necessary. For one thing, if you spray, it's going to dissipate. And for another thing, it tends to leave more marks. Now, we do get marks on our fabric, and people complain about hoop burn, but actual hoop burn is hoop damage. And it's real hard for us to damage most fabrics with one of these kind of hoops. You can get hoop marks, but if you do get hoop marks, you can take another piece of fabric and dampen it and rub over that, or steam it, or there are a couple other tricks that you can do, but it doesn't usually permanently damage your fabric. Now, once you have, I pressed that in, I didn't tell you what I was doing there, but I'm also going to gently recess the inner hoop beyond the outer hoop just a tiny bit. And now that I have this at the right tension, when I pressed that in, it did require some tension. You didn't see me stand up and bounce on it, and I haven't touched the screw. So now this is ready to embroider. It's the right tension. And when I get ready to do the next one, all I have to do is pop this out of the hoop, take my stabilizer, take my fabric, and as long as the stabilizer and the fabric do not change, I do not need to touch that screw. So I just keep using the same one over and over. So I said this was a knit, and this is a cutaway. And I see this little phrase on Facebook, if you wear it, don't tear it. Well, that sounds clever, but this is a woven shirt. I have a logo sewn on it. I did not use cutaway behind this. I used tearaway. So the general guideline is wovens get tearaways and knits get cutaways. And that's a general guideline. There are all sorts of rules and ideas about these things. But you need to factor in not just the fabric. You need to think about the design. Is the design a high stitch count design? Is it really dense? These designs that you see back here, these are appliques. So even though they're huge, they don't have as many stitches as you might find in a design that was fully stitched. The Nutcracker has 35, 36 appliques in it, and the quilt back here, all the leaves and the flower parts that you see are appliques. So that keeps the stitch count down, and they're done on cottons. So let's talk about some other fabrics here. A lot of times we like to embroider on towels. So here's a little fingertip towel. This is a terry cloth, but it's not really plush and thick. So I used a wash away topping. So I used this film topping. And I live in Arizona where it's very dry, so my topping sounds kind of crispy. But I use this on top. Now, the idea behind a topping like this is it keeps the stitches from sinking in when you're stitching. However, this is a wash away. You wash it out, then what happens? Well, then your design can start coming back up through. I'm not too worried about this little design here. Another thing we can do is, if we look at this design, maybe kind of hard to see, but this is a kind of thin satin stitch design. And it's nice for a towel because you're not drying yourself with a big wad of stitching on the back or a big wad of stabilizer. But when you have a design like this, the nap of the towel can fold over and hide the design a little bit. And it's doing that a little bit here. So one thing you can do is you can add a background. And it's easy to see on this one. You can see that big oval red background. And it shows more on here because the thread is shiny and the towel is not. So we have this big oval. And that mats down all the fabric, all the nap. So it's not going to come up through your design. But that's not very pretty. So we have another option called a lay down stitch or a knockdown stitch. And I know you probably can't see it on this one, but I just have a white background stitching going behind this design, and it's about, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 millimeters outside of the letters. So it doesn't interfere with the design at all. You don't even see it. And you need to do this in software if you can't find a design that does this. Because I mean, when we make designs, we don't know what you're going to sew it on, and you might want to sew it on something else. So designs don't often have this lay-down stitch. So you'll need to have software. Now at embroiderydesigns.com, you can find Embrilliant software, and they have a built-in knockdown stitch that will do this for you. So it might be easier to see on this little stocking that I've got knockdown stitch behind the name on here. I'll zoom in when I get in software and you'll be able to see this. So let's talk about hooping versus floating. So hooping is part of the stabilizing process. And when you hoop between the rings, when you hoop everything between the rings, then you're getting the most stable situation possible. And of course you can add a spray to make it more stable and add a basting stitch. Notice I have this big orange mat here. This is a hooping mat. And this is an older one. Newer ones are thinner and they have a grid on them. Because when you hoop on a table, it's real easy to slide your hoop around. And you can see that I'm pushing on this and my table is shaking, but my mat holds my hoop in place. So when you're hooping inside a garment, let's say a shirt or one of these critters, these are real popular. They have a little pillow and they unzip, and people like to embroider on the front of them. But you have to get your hoop in there, and it can be real hard if you don't have some nice way to hold your hoop. So there are hooping aids. This would be a very basic one. And another one would be to have a hooping station. Clear off some stuff here. And this is the Echidna hooping station. They don't have these on embroiderydesigns.com, but they do have other hooping stations. And I just have this one out here because it's small. It comes in two sizes. This is the kid size version, and then there's an adult size version. And you can see how it's shaped like a shirt. And most of the hooping stations will be shaped like that. So it makes it real easy to just pull on a shirt and hoop your garment. And it makes it real easy to hoop these kind of things because you just slide it on and you can put sticky in your hoop and put it down that way. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time showing this. I do have videos on my own YouTube channel on how to do that, and there's a longer hooping video there. So let's talk about different hoops. When you hoop, you should use the smallest hoop that can comfortably accommodate your embroidery design. And so, if you had this size design, the little elephant, he would fit in your little 4x4 hoop. But because the bib is actually done in the hoop, I needed to use a larger hoop. This is for a 6x10 hoop. Now here's what we call the 5x7 hoop. And I don't know why hoops have to be named in inches over here in the US, because the actual sewing field is always measured in millimeters, because our machine works in millimeters. So this is a 100 by 100 millimeter hoop. If you actually have a design that is 4 inches in either dimension, it is not going to fit in this hoop, because a 100 millimeter hoop is something like 3.9 or something like that inches. So 4-inch design is going to be just a touch too big. So this is your normal hoop. Your machine probably came with a couple hoops, and you can probably get extras. I have 3 5x7 hoops and 3 4x4 hoops. And what that does for me is that it means that I can be hooping the next project while the last one is still sewing. I only have one embroidery machine. Now here's a specialty hoop. This is from Dime. This is the 5x7 sticky hoop. And it's just one piece, and you can see the last thing I stitched in it. And this is sticky paper. So you just stick the sticky paper to the back, and then you can smooth your fabric down. And the nice thing about this being really thin is that on this hoop, the sides are, I don't know, maybe 1/4 of an inch, a little bit wider. And if you need to have something really flat, this doesn't have as high an edge, and it's easier to get things flat in here. Now I do use this when something is not otherwise hoopable or can't easily be hooped between the rings. So I could use it on this guy. I would probably use a 4x4 hoop on him, but I would still use sticky paper. Now, a lot of people like sticky paper for everything. And we do have water-soluble stickies now. They're more expensive. I don't like sticky unless I need to use it. I tend to use a lot of wash-away tear-away, regular tear-away, a medium-weight cutaway, and a lightweight cutaway. Here's the lightweight cutaway. It's often called no-show mesh. You can see that it's kind of see-through. I like this behind golf shirts, and I usually put it in with a tear-away. So according to manufacturers, or stabilizer manufacturers, you should not use a cutaway behind a woven because they tell me that cutaways can shrink and then you will get puckering. What I don't like about stickies is some of them can gum up your needle. Some of them don't play nice with thread. Threads tend to break more on sticky paper. And I just don't like how it makes the embroidery feel. I definitely wouldn't use it behind something like a towel because it can peel off your nap. So let's see, what should we talk about next? So let's talk about getting our design placed in the hoop properly. Now a lot of hoops come with these grids. And the grids are nice because not only does it show you a nice layout, it also shows you the dimensions of the sewing field. And you'll notice that this outline is inside the perimeter of the hoop. And when we talk about hoop size, that's what we're talking about. The sewing field. We're not actually talking about the dimensions of the hoop. Now what I noticed with the grid is that the grid center doesn't match these points at the top. You can maybe see that this outline, this center line, is off to the side of this little mark here. So I used to think that those were the center of the hoop, but evidently they're not. So if you lose your grid, you're going to have to refigure out where the center is. Now, there's some aids that can tell you how to hoop. I'm going to put this down so you can maybe see it better on this orange. And so some things that I like for hoop placement. We have the Perfect Placement Kit. And I'm not going to open this up, but there comes with a lot of grids for placement on common things. And people are always going, where should I put this? Or where should I put that? And this will help you with that. So there are videos on how to use this, so I'm not going to get into that. I will use my hooping station for placement. For example, on these towels, you can see that I have some lines down there at the bottom, some stripes. And I use those to match to a mark on my big hooping station. And then I had some other marks to help me center the design. So that, I don't know how many we sewed of these. I think maybe 16 towels at Christmas time. And all of the monograms are in the right same spot on every one of them. So that keeps you consistent. Having hooping aids makes you faster and more efficient and more accurate. So I definitely recommend getting one. Now another thing you can use is the PAL laser light. And I'll show you the box. Here's the box. This is the one I have here. And when I turn it on, it'll project a laser crosshair down onto my hoop or my fabric. And I can line things up that way. Now, we have so many lights on here for the camera that you can't even see the laser light. So even if it's on, you wouldn't be able to see it. But it's really, really handy. So there are a couple models of this one now. I like the desk mount one, but there's another little one that's battery powered that you can put on. Of course, if you have a newer machine, they have laser lights in them too. That will help you get accurate positioning. So it's all about getting it hooped accurately. So what was our embroidery recipe saying there? So remember, our recipe says, make sure design is compatible with fabric, hoop, using appropriate hooping techniques. And I showed you an appropriate hooping technique for hooping between the rings, in desired fabric location, And you might have to line that up beforehand. You can use a paddle light. You might have some templates, like this is something that you can use to line up where to put a logo. So for my shirt here, I would line up my size down here with the center of my shirt and line up this with the shoulder, and that would give me the approximate center of where that design needs to go. So we have lots of tools that can help us with accuracy. So hoop using appropriate techniques in desired fabric location with appropriate backings, toppings, and adhesives. And we've talked a bit about all of those. Now the next step is to season with threads as desired. So let's talk about thread. Thread comes in all sorts of formats. We have large cones, we have mini kings, we have small spools, and we have a wide variety of fibers and thread weights. Now, most embroidery designs are digitized for 40 weight embroidery thread, and that's normally polyester or rayon. They're pretty equivalent. They're not quite the same. But when you start switching threads, you can run into problems. Now, when I got this little guy, it came with a weird thread system. So if I pop this open, the thread came on little cartridges like this, which looks like a giant bobbin. So these didn't come in very many colors, not like we have today. And it also used 60 weight thread. So you're pretty limited on this. Now, I think the reason it used 60 weight thread was because this didn't have a lot of power. And by using a thinner thread, you couldn't build up a lot of bulk as easily. But a year later, I went from this machine to a 9-needle Melco machine. And then I wanted more thread and I wanted more colors. So the first thing we did was, it did come with, some cones like this, but then we ordered the whole range of Madeira thread. And I'll get a picture of the drawers that I have. But they do have that same thread system on embroiderydesigns.com. And if you want to get thread, if you're going to do a lot of embroidery, you need a lot of colors. And you're just better off getting a system that has a big range. When I started out, rayon was very popular. Since then, polyester has become the dominant thread brand. And back then, polyester was kind of wiry and it was hard to use and nobody really liked it. But now it works very similarly to rayon. What triggered a lot of people to switch from rayon to polyester was polyester doesn't break as easily. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, because with rayon, it was easy to snap. And that way, it didn't have a lot of stretch. But polyester can have more stretch. And so what I found when I switched from rayon to polyester was I got more puckering. And that's because if your tensions are really tight on your machine, that thread can be pulled. And when your fabric is taken out of the hoop and it relaxes over the next 24 hours, it'll shrink back to its normal size. And then you have puckers. So you really have to watch your thread tensions when you're working with polyester thread. So here we have some gold metallic. We have some really pretty variegated metallic. We have, this is I think a 30 weight, really sparkly thread. This is from Madeira. This is a soft light metallic thread. What I like about these metallic threads is they're shinier than regular thread. They're kind of metallic-y looking, but they aren't as glitzy as these. So I will substitute these into a design. These sell pretty much like rayon. I'll substitute this thread into a design where I wouldn't be able to find as many colors with this, because this one comes in 52 colors. This one probably comes in, maybe 6 colors. And because it's so shiny, you probably have to wear sunglasses to watch it. We also have some specialty threads. This is a color twist thread, and a lot of the color twist threads are actually heavier. So I'm not sure about this brand, but some of one brand in particular takes 2 40 weights and twists them together, and so it's really too thick to use in a normal embroidery. This one feels pretty normal, so I'm guessing that this is probably a 30 weight. Now with thread, the lower the number, the thicker the thread. So that's not really a thickness, it's a weight. And it's measured by a distance in weight. So it usually equates to thickness. Now you can get into some specialty threads. For example, This is glow-in-the-dark thread. Of course, it's not glowing in the dark here because we're not in the dark, but this kind of glows a sort of an eerie kind of green color. And I really like it for Halloween because it's a fun little bag anyway, but it also has a safety factor. When you use these really special threads like glow-in-the-dark or color changing, they are often thicker. And they may still be rated a 40 weight thread, but you'll find that they stitch thicker. And so what do you do then? That's where you need to use software. And so we're not going to talk a whole lot about software in here. Embroiance is sold on embroiderydesigns.com. And so what you can do is you can enlarge it without enabling the stitch processor. And what that does is it spreads the stitches out. Now you have to do a special trick in Embroiance, and most software has a way to do that. So I'm not going to explain how to do that in Embroiance. Now when you're working with thread, you have to use a needle. So what kind of needles do you use? Well, your needle is going to be based on your thread and your fabric. So right here I have some Schmetz needles and I have some organ needles. Now an advantage with organ needles is that they come in more sizes than Schmetz. And they also come in sharp and ballpoint. So here's our little organ needles, and they just come in a little paper packet like this. I also like that they're less polluting of the environment, because here we have these little plastic cases. And this is the Schmetz Gold. These are 7511s. This is pretty much a standard size embroidery needle for 40 weight embroidery thread. So I'll use a 7511. If you look on the websites of some of these thread companies, they'll tell you to use a size 90 needle. You don't need a needle that big for a 40 weight thread. It will break your thread less, but these are embroidery needles, and embroidery needles have a slightly larger eye than a regular sewing needle, and they're designed for embroidery. When we're stitching embroidery, we're stitching really fast, and when the thread goes through the needle, it's not just going through the needle and going into the fabric. It's going zzz, 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 and then it goes in the fabric. So when it's going through that eye of the needle, it's kind of like sawing back and forth, generates friction. You want to have a very smooth eye, and you want one that's working for embroidery. In fact, I use these needles for metallic thread. I do not use a metallic needle for metallic thread when I'm doing embroidery. So you can find embroidery needles online too. So as I said before, just either go back to the website if you're on YouTube, or scroll down if you're already on the website, and we have all the specials down there. Now when we're talking about thread, we also need to talk about bobbins. So home embroidery machines generally use either a size L or a class 15 bobbin. These are class 15 bobbins because I have a brother machine sitting over here, and that's the size it uses. And these are just a nice little ring of colored bobbins. Normally I use white most of the time. I don't often match my bobbin threads. I might on lace, I might on a monogram on a towel, but if that monogram has 5 different colors, I'm not changing my bobbin thread 5 different times. So you can choose to use these colored bobbin threads. Now, these are a lighter, thinner weight. So these are generally 60 weight. Some machines will call for a 90 weight bobbin. You just need to check your manual. Now, what happens if you want to match your design, but you don't have the same thread? You can get thread that's 60 weight, and then just wind your own bobbins. I like pre-wound bobbins because they're more evenly wound, and there's more thread on there than I could wind when I'm winding it myself. So you notice that I have a little thread stand here. When you're working with metallic threads, they tend to kink. And the thinner the spool, if you get those little spools that are just like the size of your pinky, especially with metallic threads, they get really kinky on there. The longer your thread path, let's find a thread that is open on both ends. If I put this next to my machine, it gives a much longer thread path so that the thread can relax and get rid of those kinks before it gets to that first take-up lever. If you put it on the top of your machine, you have about that much space from the spool to the first thread guide, and that doesn't really give it enough time to de-kink and relax before it starts sewing. So the guide for choosing needles. The golden rule here is to choose the smallest, sharpest needle that can carry the thread through the fabric without damage to the needle, the thread, or the fabric. So you can test that, if you're not sure, by threading a piece of thread through the needle and just kind of like tilting it like this. And if it slides pretty easily, then it's okay. If it slides really fast, the needle's too big. If it doesn't slide at all, the needle's too small. So that's one way you can test your needles. Also, on a single needle machine, we need to change our needles on a regular basis. When we have a multi-needle machine, you have, 9, 6, 10, 15, 12. I have a 15 needle machine. We don't have to change the needles as often because it's kind of distributed over those 15 needles. But on this machine is just a single needle machine, and so I need to change it more frequently. And when you listen to it, if you hear it going thud, 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 that's a good indication it's time to change the needle. So next, let's look at our little project. For our project, we're going to be stitching on paper. We're going to make a little greeting card. So as I record this, we're coming up towards Valentine's Day, and it's always a great time to make a little heartfelt greeting card. And stitching on paper is pretty easy, but there's some things you need to know. We'll talk about that first, and then we'll see how to stitch one. So here are a couple of designs that I got from embroiderydesigns.com, and you can see that this one is just a card, so just like a piece of cardstock, postcard size. And you can see the stabilizer still on the back. So you probably won't want to see stabilizer on the back. So one thing you can do is you could add a piece of fabric to the back. Find one that has fabric on the back. Oh no. Okay, so this one, I've just glued a piece of fabric on the back. And you can see I have a little hummingbird. These designs are also on embroiderydesigns.com. These hummingbirds were actually sewn with metallic thread. So these are the soft, light metallic thread. And you can choose to open your card sideways, this way, or this way. So for example, this card, this is a design from Pat Williams. It opens this way. But this design, I think this one's from Kinship Creations, if I remember right, it opens this way. Now when you're looking for a design, you want a run stitch design that doesn't have too tiny details. So the one from Kinship Designs, or Kinship Creations, was a run stitch design. This one was what we call a back stitch design. And I like back stitch designs for red work because normally we have to go out and travel around, then we have to come back. And on a red work design, when you travel back, sometimes it doesn't cover the line exactly. And if you use a back stitch, and a back stitch is kind of like a scrunched up satin stitch, it's kind of going like this, except it's not going on top of each other, it's kind of like a little squished satin stitch. It covers better, and you don't see that kind of problem. It also looks nice and bold on fabric. It doesn't do well on paper. So what you can do instead of sewing it on paper, which is what I did here, I sewed it on fabric. So I just hooped a piece of fabric, and I've got some fusible fleece behind there, so it's got a little bit of dimension. And notice that how on the inside of this one we see all the backing and everything. But look what we see on the inside of this one. We just see an outline stitch. Because after I stitched it out, I cut it with a rotary cutter, and I have a zigzag rotary cutter, so it's got its nice zigzag edge, and I just stitched it down with my sewing machine all the way around. So I get that nice pretty look, I get some dimension, and I don't have to worry about finishing the inside, and I haven't perforated my card. Because on this one, there are places where I've actually perforated all the way through my card. Now with these kind of designs, you can also stitch on balsa wood, and you can also stitch on metals. Now when I stitch on metal, I don't use any thread. So I'm going to pick a design where you can see the design without any thread. So if you have here's another idea for a design when you don't have a design that's really suitable for paper. What I've done here is I've taken just strips of organza, and I've just randomly cut strips with my rotary cutter, and I've glued them down In fact, I used the KK2000, just sprayed them down, and I stitched my design, and then I went around the edge with a decorative stitch to hold everything in place. And that extra bit of fabric acts like a stabilizer, and it supports my design a little bit better. And here you can see that I've glued another piece of fabric on the back, and I've got a little message. So you can have fun with this. Now, some of these designs, like this is a design I did, and this was a backstitch design, and it's done in hatch, and if you have hatch, the EMB design is available and you can change it. And because we have objects in hatch, it's real easy to just select those objects and change them from a one stitch type to another stitch type, and you don't even have to do anything special to the design beyond that. So that's a pretty easy thing to do. Now some of these I have colored with colored pencils. So this is just a normal kind of colored pencil. And here's a big project I'm working on that I've stitched this big design, and now I'm coloring it with what we call Inktense colored pencils. And these are a special kind of colored pencil that instead of regular colored pencil lead in there, they have an ink base in there. So you color with them real lightly, and then you use moisture to activate them. So I just used a regular paintbrush, and I've kind of painted them to give them a watercolor look, and you can see that I'm still not done yet. So this will be a real pretty design, and I will probably frame this. This one was done on watercolor paper. So think about different kinds of paper that you can use to stitch on. Now I wouldn't probably stitch on like printer paper. I have printed on brown paper bags, like lunch bags. Made some Halloween luminaries one year, but I didn't use any thread. The thing with a thread is that you have to watch your tensions. If your machine is really tight, then it's going to pull that thread and it's going to perforate your fabric a little bit more. Also, you might be wondering, how do we hoop this stuff? Well, we're going to use a floating method. So before we talked about why you need to hoop between the rings, paper is really stable. So once we get the first couple stitches in there, it's not going anywhere unless you totally perforate it. But we can stitch on paper with just floating in the hoop. And I like to hoop with cutaway. I'm going to come back in a few minutes. I'll have my stabilizer already hooped. I'll have it marked so I know where to put my card. And then I'll just use some tape to hold it down. Now there are specialty embroidery tapes out there now, and I'm just using blue painter's tape. I don't know if it's any different from the embroidery tapes that they have out there, but there are some like pink tapes and different colored tapes that are sold by the various embroidery supply vendors, and you can get those. So those work too. So I think we're ready to do that. You know what? I'm going to talk about this because I put it aside. I mentioned it early on. And when we're sewing on most of our home machines now have a drop-in bobbin. And what that means is if we have an issue, we somehow have to get the hoop off the machine to access the bobbin. And sometimes we have what we call a bird's nest. And a bird's nest is a big wad of thread that ends up on the bottom of your design, and it's needle thread. And usually it's the result of an improper pathing when you threaded the machine. So a lot of times it didn't get in the take-up lever. And so it's just real loose, and then you hear this horrible noise and you see your fabric being sucked down into that little tiny hole in the thread plate, and you're going, oh, now what? Sometimes it can suck it down enough that it pops the whole thing out of the hoop. But if you catch it in time, and this is why I always sit and watch my design sew. I do not walk off and let my design sew. I do not put a baby monitor on my machine. I always watch it sew because, you know, Murphy's Law has special ones for machine embroidery, and they always happen when you're not there. But this is a really cool tool, and you can slide this kind of knife thing underneath the, you see, look, it looks like a giant seam ripper kind of thing. And you just slide it under your hoop, and you can kind of saw through that. And if you haven't sucked your fabric down into that thread plate yet, you're only cutting the thread. So this is the way that you can release that hoop from your machine and recover. So you want to catch it before things have started pulling, because if it started pulling, it's going to take the tension, it's going to mess up the tension in your hoop, and when you start sewing again, it's not going to match up. So another thing you got to watch. And so there's another tool in here, and this is another thing that you can reach in there, and you can kind of look like Captain Hook's hook. And you can reach under there and just pull those things out. So these are lifesavers. Hopefully you won't need to use them very often, but when you need one, they are really, really helpful. And it does come with a few extra blades, so they're in there somewhere. So I'm going to switch now, and we'll switch over to the machine, and we'll start sewing our paper design. So now let's get ready to sew our Valentine card. So I've got my stabilizer hooped. This is cutaway, just a medium weight cutaway. And I've got my grid in here. And what I've done is I've taken my pencil and I've marked all these placement holes. And then I measured out my card, and I'm going to use one of these. And I use this little dime ruler. And what I like about this is that it measures out from the zero. Can you see the zero there in the center? So I know that I need to have this 2 1/4 inches from the center. And so I can just use this and measure out that same distance on both sides, and then same distance top and bottom, and then square it up. So paper comes in a wide variety of formats here. And I like cardstock. This is just like index card weight. And you can see we have lots of colors here. We have this pretty spring pack. And you can get these from places like Michael's and Hobby Lobby. Here's the watercolor paper that I use. And you can also get packages of greeting cards. So when you do your greeting card, you want to decide, do you want to go this way and open up, or do you want it to go this way and open up? Because you need to orient your design in the hoop properly. Because we're probably going to have to put it in the hoop this way. And when you put it in the hoop, make sure that you have the right side facing up. So if I wanted to do this one, I would hoop it like that. Actually, I'm going to turn this hoop around because it was upside down for me. I'm going to hoop it like this, because here's my bracket over here. I want the excess paper hanging out of my machine so it doesn't get crunched up. So I'm just going to use this little card here, and I need some tape. And I'm just going to use painter's tape here. You just cut it a little piece for the top and another little piece for the bottom. Line it up on my pencil marks there. I've already checked my hoop in the machine to make sure that my center grid matches up with the center where the machine thinks it is. And I'm just putting it lightly on the top and bottom. You can see that it just barely overlaps. The first couple stitches are going to catch this and hold it in place, because this is not like fabric. It doesn't shift around. The only possible problem you could have is that your design would be too dense and you would punch out the paper. Now we've discussed what you can do with that. You can lay fabric strips down and sew over that, or you can sew on fabric and then attach it to your card. So now I'm ready to put this in my machine and we'll get stitching. So it's in my machine, and now what I need to do is press the start button. But before I do that, if you have an older machine, for example, I have an older Viking, and before it stitches anywhere, it stitches right in the center. It sinks the needle in the center, and then it moves off to wherever it's going to start stitching from. And what I need to do on that machine is always advance to the first stitch in the design. So you need to know how your machine works before you stitch on paper, because you could have a hole in the middle of your paper and it's permanent. Another thing you need to do is check your tensions and make sure that they're okay. Now I'm just using a white bobbin, so I am going to cover up the back, and since we're using a cutaway, that cutaway is not going to come off. So I will need to cover it up somehow. And what I might just do is take another piece of cardstock, and maybe I'll sew on it too, and then maybe stitch it to the front, to the back of this one. So let's get going. I'll put the presser foot down and press the start button. So there we are, we're all done. According to my machine, that took 4 minutes to sew. And look how nice that looks. Notice how you can see the holes through there? You're going to see holes even if I'd use a smaller, sharper needle. Now, there have been times when I've used a really fat needle and I've used longer stitches and not used any thread at all, and then I've used it as a luminary. Looks really cool. You can do that on paper and metal. So now I just need to gently peel off my tape. Pop it out of the hoop. Taking care not to crumple my paper. Now I just need to do is cut off the stabilizer. And you'll want to cover up the back because it doesn't look very pretty. Now maybe I could have used matching thread. You're still going to have thread tails and you're still going to have stabilizer back there. So some of the things I've done are to sew on another piece of fabric and just stitch that onto the back of my card. So this is just another piece of cardstock like this. This is not a folded greeting card, and I've stitched a message on the back. And this one, you see, hasn't been stitched on the back. And notice that these also have some kind of gradated looking colors over it. And it's because I've taken nylon organza and just cut strips and glued them down. And then after I stitched, I used a rotary cutter to go around and clean off the edges. Some of these other cards, for example, this one, I stitched on fabric in the first place. Oh, got a piece of tape on there. I stitched on fabric in the first place because this is a really dense design. So adding fabric, whether by gluing it to your card in the first place or stitching on fabric and then attaching it to your card, are good ways to let you use any kind of design on a card. Otherwise, you're going to have to be very careful about what you pick. And then there was another card I showed you earlier that had fabric where I've just glued it to the inside. So these are ways that you can finish your card. Obviously, you can get a lot fancier. You could add trim, you could like add rickrack or something like that. But these are really fun and easy things that you can do. Now, when we were talking about hooping, remember I said you needed to hoop between the rings. This was an example of floating. We only float when it's not possible to hoop between the rings. Maybe because we don't have a complete piece of fabric, like if you're stitching on a collar, you can't put that between the rings. And if you're stitching on something that might be damaged by the hoop, then what do? Well, you can float. Now, floating is not all that secure. So one way that we can get more accurate hooping that's a little more gentle is to use a magnetic hoop. And I've seen magnetic hoops that look like these hoops, and then they just have little magnets stuck around the edge. I do not recommend those. If you're going to get a magnetic hoop, invest in a snap hoop. The snap hoops they're two-piece hoops, so they look like normal hoops, but they just snap together because they're magnetized all the way around. If you try to use this hoop with magnets, you're going to have to use a sticky backing because just putting a couple magnets around the edge is not going to really secure your fabric because it's not an even tension all the way around. So we've talked about a lot of things in here. There are so many cool accessories that are available to you as an embroiderer. As you get more into embroidery and you find out what you like to do, then you can figure out what direction you want to go. Now, when you're just getting started, you might want to look for a starter kit. For example, we have a starter kit of stabilizers. And another thing you might find helpful, and I just had it out, here it is. It's called the Embroiderer's Compass. And what this does is you can move it around. So for example, if I say I have a bulky knit, it'll tell me what stabilizer to use and what needle to use. So it has all these possible combinations. Now, what I do is I use this as a reference. This is not a rule because it's going to also depend on your design. If your design is really big and bulky and takes up the full hoop with full stitching, you're going to need to choose something different than if you have a lightweight redwork design that's just, light stitching all over the place. So this is good to get started. And just keep track of your results. Now, when you're getting started, everything is new and it's overwhelming. And that's why I recommend the embroidery recipe. This is almost 30 years of my knowledge all crammed into this book. And you can get it at embroiderydesigns.com. I'm sure it's listed down below if you're on the website. And if you're on the YouTube page, just switch back to the website and scroll down for the specials. And I'll post the special code right down here at the bottom. Thanks for watching, and great to see you again.